If you've gone to the hospital before, at least when you went for the first time, they probably gave you a medical history form. And if you're like me, I dread filling out forms. But there's a point to those forms. The reason they give you those forms is to know what did your father have? What did your mother have? Because history has a way of repeating itself, right? And it's the same thing with God. If you want to know God, if you're trying to diagnose your current situation, you have questions. Is God going to come through for me? I want to know God more. Then you have to be in your word. You have to read the Bible and get to know him through our fathers of faith, through our ancestors, through our forefathers. And that's why today I want to talk to us about Abraham.
One of our fathers of faith. I'm going to point out some lessons that I've learned. These are not all the lessons, and who knows, maybe God would ask me to do more about Abraham, but I'm just going to share a few key things from Genesis 11 through 13. Many of you probably know the story, but I'm going to recap or give a brief synopsis, yeah? So in Genesis 12:1, the Lord, without any details, tells Abraham to leave his country, his father's house. He's like, Abraham, get out of your country, leave, don't take your family, leave and go to a place that I'm going to show you. Crazy, right? How many of you today, God says, get up, leave your familiar territory, get up, go to a place I'll show you? How many of you would do that? It's crazy. But here's the thing. Abraham, I'm going to call him Abraham, even though at that time he was just Abram. But Abraham obeys without even a question. That is remarkable. He obeys God without a question. And we see that in Genesis 12, verse 4. He doesn't even ask, so where am I going? Okay, that's crazy, God. You're just saying I should up and leave? That takes a great level of faith. No wonder he's called the father of faith. And then in verse 2, Genesis 12:2, we see that because of this, God makes a covenant. I feel like obedience, God attaches promises to when he asks us to obey him. He attaches promises almost all the time. We see it in scripture. And we see God make a covenant with Abraham and says, I'm going to make you a father of a great nation. And then in verse 5, I think what also got me about Abraham's obedience is the fact that he was so old. He was 75 years old. This was not a time for him to up and leave. He should have been retired, not trying to be all over the place. Come on, he was 75. He was old. He should be chilling, enjoying retirement by that time, But, this is not a time to be traveling to a place that he doesn't know on this fake journey that God has him on. I just think it's remarkable that he was willing to just up and leave even at that age, at 75. It's not an age that you're adventurous and trying to explore or be unstable. So yeah, that was beautiful to see. Another thing I found remarkable was the fact that he didn't just go by himself. He went with his wife and Lot. The Lot part is questionable because God said, don't go with your, members of your household. And Lot was his nephew. So, some scholars will say, he's not supposed to have gone. He wasn't supposed to go with Lot and whatnot. But God didn't reprimand him for it. So we'll leave that aside. But, he took Sarah, his wife. I feel like it would have taken a lot of convincing, to get Sarah to leave her familiar territory as well. Sarah could be like, I didn't hear God. She could have been like, I didn't hear God. This is all you. He would have had to convince her or sell the dream or vision or just encourage her to go on this journey. So there we already see that Abraham is a leader because he's able to lead his home. Chapters later, God says in Genesis 18:19, God says, I know Abraham. I think from this experience, from the fact that he was able to lead his family, lead Sarah, out of familiar territory, God could beat his chest and say, I know Abraham. He's going to command his household after me. You know, it says, for I know him, that he will command his children and his household after me, after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord. Man, I believe that's where that comes from. You know, God was so pleased with him. God was so pleased. And you just see how God, because God was pleased, he just kept blessing Abraham, promising him blessings. And we see that as you go in Genesis 12:7, you know, he kept making promises, not just to Abraham, but to his future generation, right? He says, and the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. So yeah, we see that in verse 7. Another thing that's remarkable to note, or noteworthy about Abraham, is the fact that he loved God's presence. Like, he loved God's presence. He loved to pray. He loved to worship. He just loved to be with God. You know, we see that through the fact that he was able to build altars several times for God as he journeyed on this journey that God told him to go on. Like, he didn't know where he was going, but you would see at different stopping points, he would build an altar for God. You know, and we see that also in verse 7, the later part of Genesis 12:7 says, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. He built God an altar. Several altars. We also see in verse 8 that he called on the name of the Lord. You know, God, like Abraham loved the presence of God so much. He loved the presence. He was a worshiper. And that, you know, he made sure he consecrated places for God everywhere he went. That's special to God. God is always seeking true worship. People who are devoted to him, you know, in their words, in their worship, with all that they have. So that's remarkable that we should be worshipers like Abraham. The next point I took note of as I read these few chapters was the fact that God called him and promised to bless him, right? But his journey was not devoid of obstacles. You know, sometimes we think, you know, God has called me to be great. He's promised me. He said that there's a calling on my life. I'm going to be blessed. I'm going to be this. And we think, okay, it's just God, make it happen. It's going to just happen. It's not going to be devoid of difficulty, of challenges. And we see that in Genesis 13, that he encountered obstacles in the course of being obedient to God. The journey that God is calling you on is not going to be smooth. We see that even through Abraham's life. God promised that he was going to be blessed. He was going to be the father of many nations. But he reached Canaan, the land of Canaan, which was the promised land. And there we see that there was a famine. Abraham's like, yo, God, this is not what I signed up for. You didn't tell me this part. And Abraham, being human, he's like, God, he's like, deuces, I'm leaving. Nah. Nah, fam, this is not the life I signed up for. He's like, deuces, I'm going to the land where it's flowing. He's going to Egypt. You know, he went to Egypt. And that's not what God called him to do. But we just see the imperfections in Abraham. Even though he was praised as the father of faith, that's not to say that as Christians, we're not going to have weak moments. We're not perfect, is what I'm trying to communicate. Abraham wasn't perfect. He didn't get it right all the time. So, you know, Abraham's like, I'm not going to stay here. He goes to Egypt. He really should have remained in Canaan. He really should have. He tried to avoid the place where God had him because it didn't look like what God had for him. It didn't look bright and shiny. It was looking so gloomy. Like, imagine leaving your home. I'm sure Abraham was probably comfortable where he was, you know, in his hometown. And God brings him to Canaan and there's no food. There's a famine. Like, Abraham's like, no. But yeah. So if you read that, you see that he goes to Egypt, and after everything, he ends back at Canaan because he realizes that this is not where God wants me to be. He ends back at the same spot, and he hadn't gained much. You know, when you try to circumvent where God has placed you, you try to figure things out your way. That's what happens. You're going to go on a fruitless journey, and you're just going to end up at the same spot. So, and you might be wondering, why do I say Egypt was not the place for him? Like, years down the line, in Isaiah 30 verse 2, we see God's heart about Egypt through the prophet Isaiah. Now, another interesting fact that I saw about Abraham was the fact that he knew how to relate with his wife. Nobody could tell me anything. I just feel like Abraham knew how to talk to Sarah because, first of all, he was able to convince her to, you know, go on this journey with him. Then when he got to Egypt, he reasoned with her. He's like, Abraham, even though it wasn't the right thing to do, he lied, he used her to lie. But I just want us to take the fact that he knew how to talk to her. He told her, Sarah, you know you're a fine woman. You know you're beautiful. Come on. He could have just said, Sarah, this is the plan. Just say you're my sister. No, but he butters her up. You know, he tells her, Sarah, you're such a fine woman. You're so beautiful. When Pharaoh sees you, he's going to try to wife you. And he's going to try to kill me too. So please say you're my sister. Even though that really was a half truth. But yeah. But that also goes to show my previous point. The fact that Abraham was not perfect. By no means was Abraham perfect at all. He lied. We're not called to lie. So he lies in Genesis 12, I think. Is it? Yes. Genesis 12:19. He says Sarah is his sister.